Envisiontech podcast. I'm your host Paul Gagan, and this week we'll be continuing our discussion around aria attributes. Last week we had a rather basic overview of aria and how it's used and how it can benefit users. Now that's all well and good, but there are quite a few things that we actually didn't cover in that episode, not necessarily because they're not important, but because they're a little bit more advanced. And to be honest with you, if websites could get what we talked about in the last episode done correctly, then honestly the internet would be a much better place. A lot of these more sort of advanced, I don't want to call them advanced because that makes it sound a bit scary, but a little bit, more advanced kind of attributes really do help to complete the user experience and will make your website a lot better. So these attributes also don't necessarily apply to every website, whereas in the last episode, pretty much all of those aria attributes apply to every single website. So again, that's kind of why there's that bit of separation. So if you're interested in kind of making sure that your website is accessible for people with screen readers, then this is definitely a great follow-up episode and definitely one that you can learn something from for sure. So the first one that we're going to talk about here is actually a super important one. And you may think, well, why didn't I put it in the last episode? I said because it doesn't necessarily apply to every website. And that's going to be aria-live. So that's kind of going to be used for, as the name kind of says, things that are live. So things that are changing on your website. So, okay. A few kind of examples of this are things like chat messages and alerts. Now, alerts are a little bit more complicated, but basically what it does is it helps screen readers announce changes to dynamic content. Now, as you can understand, that's really important because if you have a live region on your page and screen readers aren't being told about new updates in there, well then screen reader users might be missing out a lot. I actually had an example. I was taking a test once, and as part of this website they have a timer, but the timer was not being read out to me on a consistent basis, so I'd have to go check the timer, which is very frustrating, obviously, when you're trying to take a test and write out the answers, etc. Especially the website itself wasn't super accessible anyway, so I actually had to write the answers out in Notepad, and that was whatever, it was a whole other thing. But because of the timer not reading out to me its updates, I actually missed the deadline to finish the test. The test was meant to be an hour long, but I didn't realize that the hour was up. So actually, I didn't even submit my last answer because I hadn't pasted it into the text box yet. So again, I actually ended up missing out on that last answer on the test, which was worth about 30% of the test, because that was not set up correctly to be read out by aria. So there's a few different versions, if you want to call them, of aria-live. So obviously there's, not being on, so it can be off. There's then aria-live polite. So what that does is it sort of announces the updates, but in a polite way. So updates are only announced when the user isn't focused on something else or navigating around. So it won't interrupt the speech. So if the screen reader is currently talking, it will finish what it's saying, and then it might read out the update from the aria-live region. There's also aria-live assertive. So again, as it kind of says, this is far more assertive. So it actually interrupts the current speech and reads out the sort of update immediately. Now, this is really important because let's say it's, real-time stock price changes or live sports scores or form validation feedback. So it's great if your user's reading something else on the page, but if they've submitted something wrong in their form, they need to know about it right then. Or, I said if they're looking at stock prices, they need to know if the one that they're currently looking at is changing price, because maybe they're halfway through, buying the stock or whatever it might be, or selling their stock, but all of a sudden, there's a big change. And the value has changed, so now maybe they don't want to sell or buy it, but if they're not made aware of that update, they could actually lose out on a lot of money, which is obviously a huge deal. So implementing these features correctly and when they're actually needed is super important. So studies have actually shown that properly implemented live regions can reduce user errors by up to 40%, which is a huge deal. in dynamic applications according to WebAIM. So again, we talked about WebAIM in the last episode, but if you haven't checked them out, please do. They're a great resource for accessibility, and they do actually a lot of interesting reports and studies on accessibility on the web. So again, 40% less errors. That is a big deal. I wish that all my users could have 40% less errors, because I tell you, whether you have a disability or not, you're probably going to make errors on forms and things like that. And if you do have a disability, it's far more likely to happen. So anything that you can do to reduce errors on forms or whatever it might be will, number one, stop users from getting frustrated with your website. They'll have a much more pleasant time. And also then you won't be getting emails like, I tried to enter this on the website and it didn't work or whatever. And, if you actually just had things set up correctly, and our error messages were being read out for those users with screen readers, then you might not get some of those emails, because I've experienced that too, where I've been using an sort of inaccessible form, I fill it out and I'm confused as to what's going on, like what is the error, what is the problem, but they haven't set it up so that it reads the error messages to me, and I don't know which field the error is even on, because again, it doesn't say anything, and when I press submit, it just doesn't submit it. So again, it's very frustrating, especially on big forms. Now this next one is aria hidden, and it may not actually seem very useful at first, but this is actually something that I use pretty often actually. So what this does is this hides elements from assistive technologies while keeping them visible on the screen for visual users. So some examples of when you might use this is for decorative images or redundant content. Now I will actually use this fairly often, because sometimes you will have some content that you want people to see, but that actually isn't going to work for screen readers sometimes. So you might actually want to hide that and have a separate implementation for screen readers. So again, very useful. Or as I said, if you have a decorative image or things like that that screen readers just don't need. You really want to remove any clutter that you can from websites for screen readers, because otherwise there can just be a lot of information overload, and if you just keep coming across decorative images all the time, it's going to be very frustrating, very annoying. So again, aria hidden is actually really important, and I actually use it all of the time. It's really, really helpful. Obviously, you want to avoid using aria hidden on interactive elements like links or buttons, because obviously then screen readers won't be able to access them, which is a horrendous thing. Obviously, if they need to be able to click it and it's set with aria hidden, they're not going to be able to get to it at all. It literally removes it from the page as far as the screen reader is concerned. So just make sure that you are using aria hidden in the proper way. So we talked about this a little bit last time, but this next one is going to be aria controls. So this will link interactive elements like buttons to the part of the page that it controls. So for example, a modal or a drop-down menu. Obviously you might use this for menus to kind of link the button to the menu, etc. So what it does is it essentially helps enhance navigation by providing a direct connection for screen reader users. This obviously also helps people easily track changes and content relationships, which again, super important when you're using a screen reader, because you won't see when a part of a page updates, so it's very important to be able to have information letting you know what is going to update and what is going to affect what. As I also mentioned in the last episode, when you can, you should be using things like the regular HTML elements for buttons, nav, and form, for example, because these already have accessibility sort of baked into them. You should really only be using aria when HTML doesn't really cover your use case, or when screen readers would need more information than the HTML is providing. So a common sort of problem here that we might come across, for example, is somebody might set a div, so any kind of element that isn't a button, to have role equals button. That sounds like it should work perfectly fine, but it doesn't. What it does is it tells the screen reader that that is a button, but you still need to add in all the functionality that a screen reader would expect from the button. It's going to tell people that it's a button, but you still need to make it a button. So obviously, you really need to make sure that you're not just saying, oh yeah, this is actually just going to be a button. You need to actually have a think, okay, what else am I going to need to add to this except for aria role? Because you still need to implement the rest of the functionality. That's again why in general you should just be using the native elements that are built into HTML, like the native buttons, links, etc., because they already have all this built in, so you won't have to add it in yourself. Now, the next sort of common pitfall here is keyboard navigation and focus management. So you again might make something a button, but you need to make sure that people can actually navigate to those. So for example, if you have a custom button that you've made, you need to make sure that it has tab index equals 0. And then what this does, it sets a tab index on the element. So it tells a screen reader that it can actually, when the user presses tab, this element should be part of that sort of tree that they can navigate to. When you press tab on a website, usually it will navigate you to the next interactive element. So that will make sure that your button that you've made will actually be, easily found by a screen reader user. Essentially what it does is it makes things that aren't usually focusable by a screen reader focusable. Now you can use tab index equals -1 for things that shouldn't be focusable by a screen reader unless they're navigating programmatically. So for example, with the arrow keys, they'll still be able to find that element, but it won't appear as if it's then sort of more interactive. So for example here, modal dialogues with aria modal equals true should sort of trap the focus of the user, preventing them from navigating outside of the modal while it's open. Now, because this happens to me all the time, a dialogue opens on a page. Number one, it doesn't move me to the dialogue, and then when I'm in the dialogue, I can really easily move outside the dialogue. Because for a visual user, you can't necessarily click behind the dialogue, but because they haven't necessarily implemented the proper aria roles and tab indexes on the page, well, it's actually very easy for me to just navigate away from the dialogue and have absolutely no problem interacting with the rest of the page, even while the dialogue's open. This actually happens on almost every website where it asks me to accept cookies. A lot of the time I don't have to accept the cookies because I can just interact with the website behind the modal. A lot of the time I can't even get to that dialogue. So again, a really big problem on a lot of websites, and I literally see it almost every time I use a website. As I mentioned last time, obviously testing these is super important. It's great to add in all these aria roles and tab indexes, but if you don't actually check if they work, then honestly it's completely pointless because you may have done it wrong and it may not work how you've intended. So using screen readers like NVDA, JAWS, or VoiceOver to test aria enhanced elements is really important. And look, I get it. Maybe you don't have a Mac, okay, and that's fine. So you can't test with VoiceOver, and you don't have an iPhone, so again, you can't test with VoiceOver on there either. You don't want to spend money on a screen reader license, so you don't want to get JAWS. That's fine. If you have an Android phone, test it with TalkBack. If you have a Windows computer, test it with NVDA. That's free. And Windows Narrator. Again, all those screen readers, those 3 screen readers are completely free. And if you do have a Mac, test it with VoiceOver. It's free. It's built in. If you have an iPhone, again, test it with VoiceOver on your iPhone. It's built in. It's free. You don't even have to install it. So there's no real excuse for not testing it. On Android, iOS, and a lot of other platforms, there's also shortcuts that you can have enabled to turn on TalkBack. So for example, on my Android phone, I have a Pixel, I can just hold down the volume keys and it will turn on and off TalkBack. So again, you can just enable that shortcut, and whenever you want to test a website, you just hold down the volume keys for a second or two, it'll turn on TalkBack, you can quickly test your website to see if it works, turn it off, and again, it's back to normal. So there's no honestly reason that you shouldn't be testing things with screen readers, especially how easy it is. They're free, and like I said, they're built in. You don't even have to install anything for some of them, such as VoiceOver, Windows Narrator, and TalkBack. Interestingly enough, actually, over 70% of accessibility issues on websites stem from the improper use of aria. So again, that's a really interesting statistic there. So essentially, if the people making these websites were to take a couple minutes, listen to a couple episodes of a podcast, read the MDN docs, whatever it might be, or just take 10 seconds, test their website with a screen reader, 70% of accessibility issues would be resolved. That is a huge amount. Like, I don't know if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, oh well, maybe there's only a few accessibility issues on each website. No, there's loads. There's dozens. If you look at the WebAIM 1 million report there, I think there's something like 56 errors on the homepage on average of the top 1 million websites in the world. And keep in mind, some of these homepages have hundreds of errors. So if you could reduce those by 70%, you could potentially be reducing it by dozens or hundreds of errors. So again, that could really improve the user experience for honestly not very much effort. And that's the thing I'm always trying to reinforce with people. Making things accessible actually won't take too much more time out of your day, and honestly isn't that much more effort. It's also not very hard. Adding a label to a button or adding aria-live to a region where there's going to be updates, again, isn't super difficult. Now, there are a couple of more complicated components that I have come across people getting wrong all the time. So for example, a tabbed interface. So let's say you're on a website and they have 3 tabs at the top of the screen, and you can click on each tab to kind of change the content that's on the screen. It doesn't actually change the page, it just changes the tab that you have currently selected. So these are constantly wrong. I rarely come across one that's made correctly and that is actually accessible. It's quite sad to say, but it's true. So the key attributes that you would use here to make something like this would be role equals tab list. So this would be for the actual container where you're going to have the tabs themselves. So you would be using this to actually contain the individual tabs you could click on. You would then have role equals tab on each one of the individual tabs. So each button or whatever it is that you're using for people to click on would have this. And again, then the actual selected sort of tab would have aria-selected equals true to indicate to screen readers which one you're actually on. And this will dramatically improve the accessibility of your website and the accessibility of your tabs right there. Just those 3 attributes would make a huge difference. Using aria-controls will be used to link the actual button that you're using for the tab to the panel that it's actually supposed to display. And sort of on that topic, tab panel as the role for the actual panel where the content is going to be displayed. So that way it will actually let the user know that they're in a tab panel, and then each tab panel will have a different name, especially if it's linked properly to the actual button that it corresponds with. So for example, this might be used on like a dashboard or a multi-step form. Let's say the first part of the form is billing information, then the next section is shipping information, then the next one is payment, whatever it might be. There might be multiple different tabs in that form or on a dashboard. You might have overview, daily, whatever it is, and these would all be different tabs. So again, really important. Now, this next bit is also really important. You need to make sure that keyboard users can navigate between tabs with the arrow keys. So when I press tab, it should bring me into the tab list, right? So where all the buttons are that you can select to change which tab you're in. When I press the right arrow key, it should bring me to the next one in the list. And that is really important, because if it doesn't, it can be quite hard for me to navigate to the next sort of button. And this is really important to get right, because if you don't, I said, sometimes it can be impossible to navigate to the next button to change tabs, or sometimes it just honestly takes a while, is very slow, and is very cumbersome. So using that, having the ability to navigate with the arrow keys to change which tab you're on is really important for screen reader users and people who are navigating by the keyboard. The next one then is modals and dialogues. And now, more recently, HTML has actually added in a native dialogue element, and you can actually make it into a modal. So in reality, you should be using this. But if you're not, a few key attributes to be using here is role equals dialogue to actually identify the dialogue itself. Aria-labeled by and aria-described by. So that would provide a clear title and description for the modal, which again is really important to let people know. That way they know that, oh, this is actually the dialogue for accepting cookies, or for filling in my information, or signing up to the newsletter, whatever it might be. In reality, when they open a dialog, they should also be moved to the dialog as well. So for example, if you have a button in the dialog, that should have autofocus, or if you have a field in the dialog, for example, it's a form, that should also, that should have autofocus instead. But again, these are all things that you need for the dialog. Aria hidden can also be used to hide the background content while the dialog is open, but again, you should really be using the native HTML dialog for this, because it will handle a lot of this stuff for you, and it will probably do a better job than most people would of making a dialog. Again, you also need to implement focus trapping to keep the user inside of the modal until it's closed. You should also be implementing things like proper keyboard shortcuts. So for example, when a dialog is open, a lot of the time you should be able to press escape to close it, and this isn't necessarily true. For example, if it's a dialog to accept cookies, maybe you don't want that because they need to press accept if they're going to visit your website. But a lot of dialogues, when you press escape, it should close. That is what screen reader users expect, and that is the behavior that should be implemented. The next one here is complex data tables. So a few key attributes for this, for example, would be aria-sort. So this would indicate sort of the sorting order, whether it's ascending, descending, or none. So again, it will just kind of give screen reader users an idea as to what's going on here. Aria labeled by. So this would be able to this would be used to help describe table headers. Aria-row index and aria-column index would provide the row and column. Now, this isn't necessarily required if you build your table properly and semantically, but again, it can be required for complex data tables. I'll talk a little bit more about that now in a second. And screen readers actually rely on proper labeled tables for over 80% of tabular navigation. So that's according to the W3C in 2023. So again, clearly really important there. Now, something to keep in mind with tables is, again, there's a lot of built-in HTML elements for this. So obviously there's the native table element, then there's the T header, the table header sort of element. Then inside of that you would have the individual sort of table headers, the less th elements. So for example, let's say it's the days of the week. So you'd have a table header of Monday, and then another one of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, etc. And then you would have the t-body element, which would then contain the individual rows and cells. So what this would do is it would say, okay, well, actually the first is on a Wednesday. So then when the user navigates to the cell that has the first of the month in it, it would say, the first Wednesday, for example. So it would actually let the user know what day of the week it is. So you can kind of understand why some of these things are really important, and that's what you can use aria label by as well for if you have more complicated data. So again, really important. You can also have sort of row headings as well. But again, it really depends on the tabular data that you're dealing with, and something really important to get right. Otherwise, it can actually be very annoying to use a table. So for example, if I'm trying to find a date and I want to, let's say, get something delivered on a Monday, but I don't actually know that Monday is the 16th. So I then have to Google, what day of the week is, the 16th of November, for example. And then I have to come back, I then have to find the 16th of November and then select it. Whereas it should just tell me what day of the week it is in reality. So here's a bit of a discussion about sort of aria in real world applications. So for example, on an e-commerce website, carts will also use aria attributes and roles a lot in sort of helping the user navigate better and understand what's going on better. So for example, you might have a notification area on the website where notifications would pop up. So that would be an aria-live region, so that when a notification pops up, it will be read by the screen reader. It might say something like added to cart, removed from cart, promotion applied, etc. So again, really important to kind of just let the user know what's going on, if their action was successful or not, because maybe it says, couldn't add to cart, or, promotion not valid, or whatever it might be. So again, really important. And also semantically labeling those, setting those with role equals alert, really important, because again, then the screen reader will actually say alert, and then the actual message that you have there. So aria disabled, for example, for an inactive button. So maybe something's out of stock. So the add to cart button will actually be disabled. So again, making sure that screen readers will announce that as disabled is really important, because otherwise I might just sit there clicking enter on the button over and over and over again and wondering why it's not adding it to my cart. Whereas the button is actually disabled for people who can see the button. So if you don't add aria disabled, then it won't actually announce that to screen reader users. Now, keep in mind, again, if you use the actual native disabled attribute, it should mark the button as disabled for screen reader users, but that's not necessarily how everybody uses buttons and makes buttons disabled. But again, that's how you should be doing it. You should be using native HTML whenever possible, but if you can't, using aria disabled is, it's required. Proper use of aria in carts can actually boost cart completion rates for users with disabilities by up to 25%. That's a pretty big deal. If you're going to have 100 customers in a month, let's say you're going to have 100 disabled customers in a month. Well, now you'll have, 125. So big deal right there. That right there's a 25% boost in your revenue right there. The next one then is social media websites. So something like Facebook, Instagram, etc. So aria in dynamic components is really important here. So for example, aria-expanded for drop-down menus and for like a more options button on a message or a post. Aria-live for real-time notifications or new messages. So when you get a new message, it should tell you, that you got a new message. Again, that's really important. And it could also be very time sensitive, so making sure that screen reader users are notified of these changes is really important, especially when you have an app open. A lot of the time it might not send you a notification on your phone, for example, so actually having it announce it while you have the app open is crucial. So all this will do essentially is enhance user experience and by providing clarity and again reducing navigation errors. So again, really, really simple. Then we have another very popular one, obviously streaming platforms. This could be like music streaming, video streaming, whatever it might be. Role equals slider for volume controls or progress bars, obviously very important. It lets the user know what they're actually dealing with. It could also be, you could also use the role progress bar as well, depending on whether the user's meant to edit it or be able to change it or what exactly it's for. So two kind of roles there that you should be using in reality. Aria value now, aria value min, and aria value max can be used to indicate the playback position, also the minimum time and the maximum time. So for example, the minimum might be 0:00. The current is 2:45, and the max is 8:16. So this would be, a video that obviously starts at 0:00, so 0 minutes, 0 seconds. They're currently at 2 minutes and however many seconds, and the maximum is 8 minutes and however many seconds. So again, really important, and that will kind of let a user know where they are in the video or the song or whatever it is, and how long is left, etc. So again, really, really important. So if you are a developer, again, please, don't feel overwhelmed by this. Start small. Implement aria attributes, even, in one component at a time. So let's say you have a cart currently, and you say, okay, I want to make the cart more accessible. Start there. Don't worry about the whole website right now. Just start off with the cart. Start off with something manageable. If you do have a streaming app, maybe start off with, the media player. Let's add in some aria attributes on the sort of progress bar for the media, or on the volume controls, whatever it might be. Maybe add in some aria labels on the buttons, for the rewind, fast forward, and play buttons, because currently they might be unlabeled. Again, it's kind of starting small is perfectly fine. You don't need to fix everything right away. If it's incremental and it takes a while, that's fine once you're trying. Obviously, testing, as I mentioned, really important, because maybe you don't realize these issues with your app or your website, but you go through and you check, and as I said, maybe those buttons in the media player are unlabeled, so people don't know, which one is rewind, play, and fast forward. They don't know actually where they are, what the buttons do. Maybe you have other buttons there as well, so maybe there's 5 buttons in a row that are unlabeled. Like, okay, what does what here? Obviously, keep learning as well. This podcast is not the be-all and end-all of aria. There's other things out there. For example, there's another attribute called aria atomic. And this is actually used with aria-live. So what this will do is it will tell it how much of the update to read. So let's say you have a chat with somebody. You just wanted to read the most recent message. So you wouldn't use aria-atomic in this scenario. You'd set it to false. But let's say you wanted, let's say it was a live score update for any kind of sports game. So you might want to use aria-atomic here, because if you didn't, let's say somebody was on 14 points and now they're on 18 points. Well, when that update occurs, all the user would hear is 18. But you would actually want to use aria-atomic here and set that to true, so that it'll say the team name, 18, and then maybe dash, and then 12, and then the other team's name, because it will read out the team name and the score for both teams, just to be sure that you know who is on what score exactly. Because obviously that's really important. If it just says 18, it's like, okay, who's on 18? I still need to go check. It's great. It tells you, the score changed, but you need more information than that. So again, this is not the be-all and end-all guide. For Aria, I didn't tell you about every single role out there, every single attribute out there, just the ones that you'll probably use the most. So again, do keep learning, and obviously these things might change over time. So if you listen to this podcast now, in 5 years, it's quite likely that there'll be new Aria attributes, or that some of them might work a little bit differently. So it's also important to kind of stay on top of things as well. Now, just remember, again, accessibility is an ongoing process, and Aria attributes are a key part of the journey to kind of building a web that works for everybody, which is obviously really important. Everybody should be able to access your website and your app. So again, it's not just, I've implemented Aria and now I have to worry about it again. It's an ongoing journey. So, staying on top of things, making sure that when you're adding in new things, that you're also using Aria with those, really important. Because again, we want everybody to be able to access your service, your website, whatever it is. That is actually going to be it for this episode of the Envisiontech podcast. So if you did enjoy this, make sure that you come back next time for our next episode. And I hope that you've taken something away from this episode and it's helped you learn something about accessibility and Aria. As always, this is the Envisiontech podcast. I've been your host, Paul Gagan, and I will talk to you all next week.